sorry for going over here a little bit.
You know what?
Marital counseling, I just through that. You start off with that. We're here to counsel twice. It's an 8-week segment. Every 16 weeks. Normally it's 8-week segments. So you can figure out a lot of work. Maybe a lot of writing.
Everybody get your attention, we'll bring it back together.
Did you not agree? There's no question.
She's going to be real excited. Yeah. Hey guys, let me have your attention just a moment. Remember last evening we talked about we want to share and invest in Dr. Yates' ministry. He has been so kind and gracious to come. I thank Charles and Beth for their graciousness in getting him here and taking care of him. But we want to minister to him and sow into his life and ministry. And so I've already got a check here that someone had to, don't have to leave, gave to him to Bob. Jen, I've got our check here. We got to Northcrest Baptist Church, and right on there, Dr. Gary Yates. And then we're going to turn these in, and our financial secretary will make one check out to him. But let's love on him and minister to him and thank him for coming. And I appreciate him so much. And let me ask you this. Would y'all be willing for, Lord willing, next year we could have him back for a weekend to where he can be here on Friday, Saturday, and then do both services on Sunday? And would y'all come?
Amen. Yes.
Good. I'd like to get the whole church involved in this. This all kind of came together very, very quick, and we had to tweak some scheduling, but it all worked out good, and I've been blessed by you being here. And so you give your offering to Charles. Charles, I'll let you come and receive the offering right there, okay? And,
are you going to do it tomorrow also?
Yeah, we're going to do it tomorrow morning also. In the morning also, to let everybody know about that, okay? All right, and y'all can do that after the service before we dismiss. Take care, okay? Doc.
Thanks. Seriously, just the best blessing I can receive is just having the opportunity to actually teach the scriptures. And if people will sit and listen to me, I'll come do it. I don't care where you are. So that's a blessing. I can't even get my kids and wife to listen to me anymore. So. But anyway, I want to go to the next section on the Lord's judgment of the nations, and my goal is hopefully by 11 o'clock to finish the section on 13 to 23 and 24 to 27, and then hopefully to spend the last little bit of our time together this morning talking about the second half of the book and the servant of the Lord and the suffering servant. I wanted to highlight on that because I think it's really important for us as Christians. Sometimes one of the questions people ask me about the prophetic books is the United States in prophecy anywhere? You know, and I think that's, you know, obviously there's a reason why we're interested in that. What's interesting about that, though, is that I think a lot of people want to take passages about Israel and apply them to the United States. You know, we're kind of the chosen people of God. But God doesn't have that same kind of relationship with us. If we want to find the United States in prophecy, unfortunately, I think we have to make our comparisons more with all the pagan nations that were around Israel. So, and I don't mean that to be negative or unpatriotic in any way, just that's the reality, the nations of the world and how they relate to the Lord. But what we have in 13 to 23, we have another definite, I think, clear section in Isaiah where Isaiah is primarily talking about the judgment of the nations. And so again, we can't go through all of these, but we're going to highlight a few of them. And actually, I want to go down to the so what question on page 9, because we're looking at all these nations, and you might be looking at some of these and saying, okay, Babylon, I know, that's where Iraq is, but Babylon itself isn't around today. Assyria is not a country anymore. The Philistines haven't been around for a while. I don't even know where Cush is. Never heard of Duma and Arabia. So, what significance do these judgment messages against these ancient nations, what do they have to do with us today? What's the so what of these oracles in the book? I think they're in the book of Isaiah for a couple of reasons. Number one, they show that God is the Lord over all nations. He's not just the God of Israel. And in most of these people, they have their own national deities. And so, with the idea would be, well, Israel, he's the national deity, or Yahweh is the national deity of Israel, but all these other nations have their own gods. This section is saying, no, the Lord is not just the God of Israel, he's the God over all nations and all peoples. I think the second thing that this section did is that it discouraged Judah and Israel from making alliances with these people. Okay? If we're going to get out of this situation that we're in, making alliances with these nations isn't going to be the answer, because they stand under God's judgment as well. And then I think the third thing is that the judgment of these nations was a promise to Israel that God was ultimately going to make things right. And they were being oppressed and they were being persecuted by these nations, but ultimately God was going to make these things right. Now, the interesting thing is that in chapters 13 and 14, the first nation that is mentioned that God is going to bring judgment against is Babylon. Okay? And I think I want to focus on this for a few minutes because there's an interesting passage in chapter 14, but also the most powerful nation in the world of that time, Assyria and Babylon, they're the two nations that are targeted up front. They're going to become the objects of God's judgment. And Babylon was going to be the nation that ultimately was going to take Judah into exile. But even the Babylonians, as great and as powerful as they were, even the Assyrians, as awesome and fearsome and terrifying as their army was that we talked about last night, God is going to judge these nations as well. And just wanted to just highlight just how great Babylon really was as a nation. Herodotus, this Greek historian, after the time of Isaiah, said, Babylon surpasses in splendor any city in the known world. And just a couple of things that would have been true of Babylon around the time of the Old Testament. They had a wall around the city that in places was 100 feet high and wide enough for two chariots to race side by side on. So this is a fairly impenetrable city. One of the famous landmarks in ancient Babylon would have been this the Gate of Ishtar. And you can see how beautiful it was, what an imposing structure this is. The bulls and the dragons that are on there representing the gods of Babylon. This was a powerful city. And have you ever heard of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon? Nebuchadnezzar built them, and actually built them for his wife, because she was from the mountains, and she missed the mountains. And I think Babylon, Iraq, is about 130 in the shade, and there's not a lot of hills and mountains there. So he sort of built this artificial structure to make his wife think about the mountains back in her own country. So a great, powerful, wealthy nation. The palaces and things of Nebuchadnezzar have been discovered by archaeologists. At one time, liberal scholars said, we don't even know if Nebuchadnezzar really existed. And then in about 1899, there was a German archaeologist who discovered the ancient city of Babylon, found the structures that were associated with him. No one would even question now if Nebuchadnezzar was a real historical figure. The Chronicles of Nebuchadnezzar explaining the key things that happened during his reign and even capturing the city of Jerusalem, those things have been discovered by archaeologists. So this great, powerful nation, Babylon, is the first one that's mentioned in these judgments against the nations, that the Lord, even Babylon, in all of its power, all of its greatness, all of its glory, even Babylon stands under God's judgment. And so you think of any nation, any empire in all of history, what's happened to all of them? They crumble and they fall. And I think it's easy for us as Americans to think we'll always be here. Our military is what makes us strong. We're the greatest nation on earth. And I think, a lot of those things are true. But ultimately, the same thing that's happened to America, or that's happened to all these other nations, it's ultimately going to happen to America. And Billy Graham has said, if God doesn't punish America, then He's going to have to apologize to Sodom and Gomorrah. I don't like thinking about our country in that way, but when we look at God judging these other nations and peoples, we're reminded that that's the ultimate destiny. We all stand under God's judgments as peoples and nations. So one of the other things that the Babylonians prided themselves about, or they felt made their city impenetrable, is that this bridge that went across the city, they actually took parts of that up at night to where an enemy army couldn't simply just march across the bridge and go into the city. So Babylon viewed itself often, especially during the time of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, this city is impenetrable. And so when Isaiah is talking about the fall of Babylon, a couple of hundred years before that ever happens, imagine how hard it would be if you're a Jew hearing these things to believe that this was ever going to happen. I mean, you're talking about this great, powerful, invincible, mighty city. That's actually going to fall under God's judgment, and the answer is yes.
That's the Tigris.
Yes, the Tigris River, and that was another thing that made this city very secure, is that it's right on this river, and very difficult for an enemy army to get there and to attack it.
It's probably where Alcatraz got their idea.
Yeah, it's kind of almost like a sort of an Alcatraz type thing. But the Lord is going to judge Babylon, and on page 10, let's just look at a couple of verses. First of all, before we get to this one, let's look at what it says in chapter 13, verses 6 to 8. The prophet says, "Wail, for the day of the Lord is near. As destruction from the Almighty it will come. Therefore all lands will be feeble, and every human heart will melt. They will be dismayed. Pangs and agony will seize them, and they will be in anguish like a woman in labor. They will look aghast at one another. Their faces will be aflame. Behold, the day of the Lord comes, cruel with wrath and fierce anger, to make the land a desolation and to destroy its sinners from it." Now, this is one of those places where I think prophecy probably has a dual referent, like we've already been talking about. It's talking specifically about the judgment of Babylon, and they fell to the Persians in 538 BC. But I think Isaiah is looking beyond the judgment of that one nation, and he's seeing the judgment of all nations. The day of the Lord is not just something that was going to fall in that day, but the judgment of Babylon is a picture of how God is ultimately going to judge the whole world. And so these nations and these people, the ones that we've looked at here, Duma and Arabia and Assyria and Babylon, they're not necessarily around anymore, but the judgment of those nations in history demonstrates the reality that ultimately there's going to be this final day of the Lord, and this is going to be a judgment that falls on the whole world. So this terrible, awful judgment that's being described here, I don't think it's just about the fall of Babylon. It's ultimately pointing, God is going to judge the whole world. And every time that God has judged some nation in the past, it's a confirmation that that's going to happen in the future. I think in 2 Peter 3, Peter says that in the last days, people will be saying, hey, where's the promise of His coming? Things will continue as they always have, and they're calling into question if there's ever going to be this day of the Lord. But if you look at past history and how God has judged nations throughout history, then it's a reminder it's ultimately going to happen to us as well. So this is not just about the judgment of Babylon. this is also about the judgment of all the world. Now, in chapter 14, there's more of a personal message about the king of Babylon. And, you know, in college football, if you ever watch a college football game, one of the things that goes on a lot in college football or college sports in general, trash talking. And this almost is Isaiah is sort of taunting the king of Babylon. Okay, you think that you're this great, powerful, mighty ruler with this great army. You're going to ultimately die and go down to the grave just like everyone else. And so there's sort of really kind of this mocking, trash talking of the king as he dies and goes down to the underworld. And so let's look at verse 4. How the oppressor has ceased, the insolent fury has ceased. The Lord has broken the staff of the wicked, the scepter of the rulers that struck the peoples in wrath with unceasing blows, that ruled the nations in anger with unrelenting persecution. The whole earth is at rest and quiet. They break forth into singing. Okay? So this guy dies and everyone throws a party. And I don't know if you've ever seen the version of the musical of A Christmas Carol that they show on TV, and Scrooge dies and they have this big dancing scene. Thank you very much. That's the nicest thing that anyone's ever done for me. That's what everybody's going to be saying about the death of Nebuchadnezzar or the death of this king. Thank you very much. You've died and you're gone and you're out of the way. And so then as he goes down to the underworld, down to the grave, it says in verse 9, Sheol beneath is stirred up to meet you when you come. It rouses the shades to meet you, and all who were leaders of the earth. It raises from their thrones all of them who were kings of the nations. All of them will answer and say to you, you have become weak like us. You too have become like us. Your pomp is brought down to Sheol, the sounds of your harps. Maggots are laid as a bed beneath you, and worms are your covers. So it's almost like all of these other kings that have died before him, many of them maybe that have been killed in battle against the Babylonians because of his oppression and all the terrible things that he's done. It's almost they're in hell and they're like, hey, look who's coming down to join us. And this king that was so great in the past, he's become just like one of the rest of us now. He's dead, he's done away with, and really it's just kind of mocking him and taunting him. And all of these other people are pointing him and saying, you're just like one of us right now. And come and lay down on your maggot and worm bed, and you're going to be here for a while. So God is going to bring down this great king. And remember last night we said that one of the themes in Isaiah, God has to be exalted and man has to be humbled. Here you have this king who represents the height of human power. And ultimately he's going to end up lying down on a maggot bed and staying there for eternity. So this is the judgment that's going to bring. Now, if you're familiar with this passage, there's a very controversial thing going on here. But in chapter 14, what we have going on, the kings of the earth can't believe that the king of Babylon has joined them. You're down here with the rest of us. And then the king of Babylon is not even going to be given a proper burial when he dies. Okay, but there's another passage in chapter 14, and I want to read this one, and I want to ask you the question, who is this verse talking about? Because when we go chapter 14 and verse 12, let's read what it says there. How have you fallen from heaven, O day star, son of dawn? How you are cut down to the ground, you who laid the nations low. You said in your heart, I will ascend into heaven above the stars of God. I will set my throne on high. I will sit on the mount of the assembly in the far reaches of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds, and I will make myself like the Most High. All right, the question I want to ask, who is that verse, or who is that passage? Who's it talking about?
A lot of people think Satan.
Okay. All right, Lucifer or a lot of people thinks, Wade, why did you qualify it?
Because in context, it's talking about Nebuchadnezzar. I mean, I've heard it said both, but I don't know.
It goes too far to be Nebuchadnezzar, though. Don't
Okay.
you think? I mean, it describes too much for an earthly king.
Yeah, it seems to describe, and you guys have raised the real problem here. The verses seem to describe someone that is more than human. I'm going to ascend up to the stars of God and all this. But the context, both before and after this passage, it's talking about a king. And it even goes on to say in verse 15, but you are brought down to Sheol, to the far reaches of the pit, and those who see you stare at you, ponder at you, and ask the question, is this the man who made the earth tremble and who shook the kingdoms? So it sounds like more than a man in some of these verses. But the larger context, it's talking about this specific king. So anybody else have any other thoughts about this? Who's it talking about? If it is talking about someone other than a man, then Satan or Lucifer seems to be the individual that's in view here. Anybody want to solve this one for us?
Historical context?
Yeah, we're almost back to exactly the same
Session.
issue.
What, doesn't this parallel what we talked about in the first session? You know, sort of, same type,
A dual.
yeah, dual meaning here?
I think there could be a dual meaning here because obviously context is talking about a man, this king that's going to be brought down. The language that seems to make him out to be more than a human may simply be an expression of his own pride. I mean, this guy thinks that he is a god, and I'm going to ascend above the heavens, and I'm going to do all these things. Remember the pride of Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel chapter 4? He goes out one day and looks over his empire and he says, isn't this Babylon the great city that I have built with my own hands? And, aren't I a great and wonderful guy? And remember what the Lord does to him? He turns him into an animal. And he goes out and eats grass and gets long fingernails and lives outside for a while and becomes kind of hairy until he humbles himself and recognizes the greatness of God. Yes?
How could just a man fall from heaven? Or is heaven something else beside hell?
Yeah, and I think it depends on how literally do we take this. I mean, it may be describing him in these kind of terms, again, just as a way of sort of mocking his pride. And here's the picture of this shining one, the son of the dawn, falling from heaven. I think here's the picture of what this is actually going on. If you go outside in the night and you find the morning star, Venus, at night it's in a very prominent place in the sky. And very bright, very exalted. And that's sort of the king of Babylon in his height of power. He is this bright star, this impressive, almost like a god. But what happens to that star as soon as the sun comes up? It disappears. In light of the sun, that star isn't so bright. So it's like this bright morning star that's at its height of glory at night. It falls from the heavens when the sunshine comes up. So I think primarily this passage is talking about the king of Babylon, but behind all of this, I think there's a reminder of the power behind the throne. And we do have a lot of reminders in the Old Testament and New Testament that Satan is the god of this age. And that he really has his grip and his clutches in the governments of the world and the kings of the world. And that doesn't mean that everyone who is in government is an agent of Satan. Okay, I'm not one to say that. I had a slide that had a picture of Congress, and then it said Satan's government above it. I decided to take that one out. It seemed a little, okay? I don't want to offend anybody. There are a lot of great people in government, but what it does mean is that in the empires of the world, and really even in the world system that our own government is a part of, Satan has his clutches in that. And I think this passage is a reminder that there's a power behind the throne, even if Satan is not the one that is directly referred to. We almost are at this place again where we have kind of a dual reference.
Think about the New Testament where Jesus was talking about Simon cast down, from cast out of heaven.
Yeah, and that's not talking about the fall when he fell back in the garden. It's talking about something that's happening in the future with relationship to the ministry of Jesus. So Satan is a very powerful person. In the temptation, bow down to me and I'll give you all the kingdoms of this world. I think Jesus doesn't challenge that he owns it. It's just that he's not going to bow down and worship.
We don't have in this passage what we have in the virgin birth passage, though, some New Testament reference that pulls us to make us believe this. Why did this become a Satan's fall passage in the first place? Is it because the King James?
It's actually because of the Latin Vulgate, where this reference to the son of the dawn, the bright shining one, that became, it's translated in Latin, Lucifer. And so, as it came over into our English Bibles, Lucifer was taken to be kind of a name for the devil. But there's no other place in the Bible where Satan is called Lucifer. That just comes out of this passage. And I think a better translation of this is day star, bright and shining one, son of the dawn. And it is a reference to the morning star, kind of being a picture of the pride of this king. But that's a big part of where Satan came from in this passage.
What about the other Old Testament passage? I think it's Ezekiel, what do you think about that one?
Well, I think you have a similar thing going on, that in context, it's about the king of Tyre.
Right.
And I think he's comparing him either to Adam being in the garden, or he may be comparing him to Satan in some way, but it's not a direct reference to Satan. It's, again, I think something we can see more secondarily.
But even there, is it the language so grandiose that
Yeah.
it's too much for a man?
Yeah, you were an exalted cherubim, and
Right.
you were in the garden of God. And again, is that literally true of this, or again, is it just a way of just like poking a hole in how arrogant and proud this man really is?
What about in that reference, is like that coming from the Latin Vulgate? Do we have anything similar there?
No, I don't think there's anything translation. I think it's just the idea of, again, a man being described as an anointed cherub,
Right.
being in the garden of God. But again, some of those connections that people are making to Satan, I think some of that kind of has been developed out of Christian tradition more than explicit, clear references in the text itself. But you do really have to kind of consider these two passages together. And I don't want to deny any type of connection with Satan, but again, I think it's something that you see more in light of all of Scripture,
Right.
rather than the specific references in this text.
The big question to me with those two would be, what else could they be talking about with that kind of language? Yeah, that's what I've asked myself. If it's not talking about him, that seems like just too much to say.
Yeah, if it's not talking about the fall of Satan, then it's simply a poetic way of a very exaggerated description of how pride. I think with like the one in Ezekiel 28, this guy thinks that he's Adam in the garden. He's the original uber human. He's like he's the man, and I think that may be kind of what's going on in that particular passage.
So do we have a description of the fall of Satan anywhere else?
In the Old Testament, not a very clear one. And where exactly does Satan come from? If we take these two passages away, it undermines a lot of that. So that may be, I think, another reason why, well, maybe we do need to see some kind of reference to Satan.
Then all we have is Genesis, the garden, right?
Yeah, the serpent just shows up. And we don't he fell from heaven and all these kinds of things. The New Testament is going to talk about Satan being an angel. And the passage that the pastor referenced, though, about the fall of Satan, that's not about the fall that took place in the past.
Right, because that's when the 70 went out, right?
Right, yeah.
Okay.
And in Revelation, I think it's in Revelation 12,
Right.
there's a war in heaven, and Satan is taken down. But again, was that what happened before the Garden of Eden? We don't know. Satan just sort of shows up. And there are really very few references to him in the Old Testament in general. You could look at, there's probably, you have Job.
And Job, he's up in heaven. He's up in heaven. In Job.
Yeah, in Job, he's still up there.
You have access.
Yeah, I think he still has access.
Just think about what you were talking about when, he tempted Jesus, and Jesus did not refute what he was saying. He did not rebuff him there. That when Adam sinned, he gave the title to Eve. The Bible called him the prince of the power of the air. That, you know, Adam sold out. And, you know, the consequences of that today, we're sinners by birth, by nature, and by choice. But I still, you know, and I've looked in studying and in seminary being taught, you know, all of these different the viewpoints, you know, of the context of the king of Babylon and Satan. I still believe the son of the morning fell and became the father of the night. You know, I've got to look at that because you cannot, where did he come? There's just not a whole lot of scripture dealing with what happened.
If we take away these passages, then, yeah, we have very limited understanding of where Satan came from.
But it goes back to what you were saying, the fact that he is empowered by Satan.
Yeah, and here's one other passage that I think clearly makes that idea in the Old Testament. Daniel chapter 10 talks about the prince of Persia and the prince of Greece, and they're these angelic powers. It's not talking about the human king. So it's almost like there's a demonic power behind the human power. And I think whether you see a direct reference to Satan in this passage or not, I think that idea at the very least is there. And you know, what's this king's sin? Pride. What's the sin of Satan? It's pride. So you know, he's definitely related to. He's a satanic-like figure. So,
I think we have the
good question. Again, it's one of those I was hoping no one would ask me about. I was flying down yesterday.
I think we have the counterpart in Revelations, though, where he gives the letters to the churches and says to the angel of those churches. So, you know, we have in Scripture it showing that those beings, angels and demons, are there. So it shouldn't surprise us if those scriptures are about Satan.
Okay, so, and you know, there's an angel that's coming to bring an answer to Daniel's prayer in that passage in chapter 10, and it takes him 3 weeks to get there. So it's just like, there's some pretty incredible spiritual battles going on. And I think sometimes we don't realize, like even in things going on in our government and all of it, that there's spiritual battle that's part of all of this as well. It may give us a little bit of caution in thinking that government is always going to be the answer. And I think, you know, a lot of Christians sometimes have made that mistake, that, you know, politics and government, I think it's great when Christians are involved in that and they're influencing it, but if that's what you're looking for as your ultimate answer, you better remember that satanic, you know, connection that's there and how the fall has affected all of that.
Well, I don't want to get too far off on the subject, but I'm kind of one of these late comers. I had some things that going on, but I'm glad to be here. But I wanted to ask you a question, not getting off Isaiah, but where do we, as a people, where do we get off in terms of worshiping as kings, as individuals, even when Moses was leading the people, the Israelites, you know, where did they get off in terms of worshiping idols, you know, the Baals, the statues? Because even the kings got into that, you know, when they exalted themselves and, you know, I'm powerful, I'm able to do this. Because, you know, of course we know our Almighty is the one that's exalted and the one that's able to do all that. They put themselves in a situation and God had to let them know, hey, I'm still God. I'm still in control. I'm still able to do it. And it's like, even we had chances after chances when we get into situations and, you know, God would come through. But then when we get back to ourselves, and it's like, you know, I guess that's where, is that where Satan came in? It's like, okay, idle minds, and you just...
Yeah, I think he's the ultimate promoter of worshiping something other than God, and for him, worshiping himself. And I think a passage that fleshes this out a little bit is Romans chapter 1. They worshiped the creation or the creature rather than the creator. And it all goes back to, I think it all goes back to the fall. When Adam and Eve committed the original sin, that's what they were doing. And so part of the effect of the fall is that we have it hardwired into us as humans because of our sin nature to worship the creature rather than the creation. And I think we're definitely seeing that in Isaiah, and that's why I saw the Lord seated on his throne, high and lifted up. The Lord needs to be lifted up, and man needs to be brought down. And that's the problem that Israel had. Yeah.
I think too, a lot of times as Americans, we defend our country probably too much, saying that, it's a chosen country and all this stuff. We gotta remember that anything that's touched by man is stained. So even the church has that problem. There's wolves dressed in sheep's clothing too. So we can't let the pride of the church get in the way.
Yeah, in times in history, the church has promoted apostasy as much as any secular organization.
It's established by God, but it's allowed to be influenced by him.
So I think there are things that are in this passage that are relevant for us thinking about how God is going to judge the earth in the future, not just how God judged these nations in the past. So those are great points. Yes?
When you see an athlete get up on television and do this deal, I'm the greatest, and that I form idolatry.
As long as it's, if it's somebody that's on my team, it's okay. Yeah, I think so. But there's pride manifests itself in a lot of ways other than just, as Baptists, we're kind of humble. We don't want to stand up and say I'm the best. We just think it.
Pride comes before a fall.
Yeah, it definitely does. So,
Dr. Yates, also in this, there's a lot of millennial overtones in Isaiah, right?
And I think there's a lot about this that sort of this king mirrors the final enemy that God is going to judge before God's kingdom comes to the earth. And I think that's why the enemy is described under that the empire of Antichrist in Revelation is called the great city of Babylon. And whether that means that Satan's headquarters are going to be in Iraq or not, I don't think that's necessarily the point. I think the idea is more there's going to be a Babylon just like the one in history that oppose God, oppose God's people, and really it's going to be a world system that draws in all the nations of the earth, regardless of where it's located. And so we're going to see history kind of repeat itself in the future. There's going to be a ruler that opposes God and his people just like Babylon did. So, yeah.
You mentioned how this divides us yesterday, but knowing as much as you know about Isaiah and the rest of the Old Testament, is it pretty hard for you to accept anything other than premillennial? I mean, do you feel like it's a hard sell to say there's going to be no millennial reign?
Wow, thanks again for I don't know that it's easy, but I think the reason that I hold to a premillennial which basically just the idea that God has a future kingdom for Israel, is that I believe God has made certain covenant promises to the people of Israel that I think he's obligated to keep those promises. And that involves, a kingdom for Israel. It involves a king on the throne. And so I think the millennium is important to fulfill these Old Testament covenants and promises. And there's ways that we as the church are already experiencing many of the promises that God has given to Israel. But there's still that side of the specific things that God has promised to those people. I don't think that's done away with just by, what God's doing in the church today.
And you really hammered this yesterday with the theme of God's faithfulness in spite of our unfaithfulness. And it just seems to me like it would go in the face of that. To say that Israel could have been away. Yeah,
that the church has just basically replaced Israel. To me, I kind of have a problem with that idea. But I realize, there are a lot of Christians who disagree with that.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. Let me point out two other just real quick things in chapters 13 and 23 that I don't think will take as long as that passage on Babylon. There's really kind of a surprise element in Isaiah 22. And the surprise element is that in these passages where God is going to judge the nations, there is a passage about the judgment of Jerusalem. Okay? And this is after they have been delivered. Remember when Sennacherib's army was destroyed in 701? This passage talks about how the city of Jerusalem had this wild party and they begin to celebrate about this. But instead of turning to God and using this as an occasion to repent of their sin, They're just basically celebrating. It's like, hey, we got off the hook. So here you have in this section that's talking about the judgment of all the nations. There's the judgment of Jerusalem with that. And I think the idea is just, Israel's just as wicked as all of these other people. And so they're just as deserving as the other nations are. Okay? Now, there's a second surprise element in Isaiah 19 to 25. And for those of you that, whoops, sorry about that. For those of you that have a heart for missions and for world missions, I think Isaiah 19 is one of the greatest missionary passages in all the Bible. Missions did not begin with Isaiah 28, go into all the world and make disciples. It did not begin with Acts chapter 1, verse 8, you're to be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the uttermost parts of the world. Missions began in the Old Testament. In Genesis chapter 12, God says to Abraham, all the nations of the earth are going to be blessed through you. So in this passage, 13 to 23, that's all about the judgment of the nations. There's an incredible promise to the nations of the world in Isaiah 19. First, verse 22 says, in that day there will be an altar to the Lord in the heart of Egypt, and a monument to the Lord at its border. So Egypt, that was Israel's greatest enemy in the past. There's going to be an altar to God in the middle of Egypt. And that's almost like saying there's going to be an Alabama gift shop in the middle of Tuscaloosa or something. Or, I mean, I'm sorry. Auburn. Yeah, at Auburn. Okay. That rivalry is pretty intense. So there's going to be, in Egypt, Israel's great enemy, there's going to be an altar to the Lord. And then it gets even more interesting. In that day, Israel will be a third, along with Egypt and Assyria, a blessing on the earth. So God isn't going to have one people in the future kingdom. And again, this I think is a reference to the kingdom in the millennium. There are actually going to be three peoples of God. And Israel is going to be the chosen people of God. Egypt is going to be the chosen people of God. And Assyria is going to be the chosen. Israel's greatest enemy from the past is Egypt. Israel's greatest enemy from the present is Assyria. And those people are going to be part of God's people, God's chosen people in the future. So you end up having the chosen people of the Lord are Israel, Egypt, and Assyria. Now, Assyria is not around anymore, and Egypt is a much different group of people than were around in Isaiah's day. I think Egypt and Assyria basically represent all the nations and all the people of the world. Isaiah is saying the same thing that it tells us in Revelation. People from every tribe, every nation, every tongue, every language group, they're going to be part of the chosen people of God in the future. And so the Lord's going to judge these enemies, but the Lord is also working to save them, to bring them to himself. And so the plan of missions, that's not just a New Testament concept. That's also Old Testament as well. And we might wrap up this session. Let's look over at Isaiah chapter 49, verse 6. We'll look at this one verse and we'll take one last quick break here. When this servant comes in the future to save Israel, the Son of the Lord is not just going to be Israel's Savior, but it's also going to say, is it too light a thing that you should be my servant to raise up the tribes of Jacob and to bring back the preserved of Israel? I will also make you a light for the nations, that my salvation may reach to the end of the earth. So the future mission of this servant who comes to save the people of Israel is not just going to be to save Israel, but he's going to end up being a light to all the nations. And I think that's exactly what we have going on here in Isaiah 19. Israel is going to be the people of God. But so will Egypt, and so will Assyria. This is a pretty incredible missionary passage. All right. Any questions, comments, or thoughts about that? And if not, we probably need to take one last break, and we'll finish up here by 12.
I believe it's God's intention originally that Israel was to be the missionary people to the world when they formed the ball.
Yeah, actually that leads into what we're going to talk about in the next session. God tells Israel that you're going to be a kingdom of priests. And so their job was to be the priestly nation that brought all of the other people to the Lord. And they failed in that mission. But that's what God was ultimately doing. Not just making them the chosen people so that they could be blessed, but ultimately so that they could become the instrument of God's blessing to the whole world. And I mean, that's what God is calling us as the church to do as well. You know, I didn't just save you so that you get on the blessing. I saved you, and I created you and brought you into the church and made you the body of Christ so that ultimately you can be the light that brings that salvation to others as well. And so that ends up being very important. Okay. All right, anything else? Yes.
Just quickly, talking about Israel, is that direct descendants of Abraham? Who's he referring to? I know you mentioned some. I think it's the modern day church, but is it bloodline of Abraham? Is he talking to the nation of Israel? Is he talking to symbolic, descendants of Abraham?
Okay, so it's like you guys have gotten
It's
every possible hard question.
It's not a cut and dry.
I think it's talking about the physical descendants of Abraham. And there, in a special way, God is going to bring a remnant of them to himself as the kingdom comes in. And they're going to turn to the Lord, they're going to believe in Jesus as their Messiah, and they're going to be saved leading into this millennium. It doesn't mean every Jew. It doesn't mean every Jew that has ever lived. It doesn't mean every Jew even that will be alive in the last days, because there's going to be a judgment of Israel that precedes them coming to the Lord. And so it will be a remnant of the physical descendants of Abraham that will turn to God in the last days. And a real key passage in all this is Romans 11, that all Israel is going to be saved, and God still has a future for his chosen people in that respect. Okay. Hopefully I dodged that one. That's a great question. All right, let's take a break for maybe about 5 minutes or so, and we'll try to finish up and wrap up at 12 o'clock.
Get up.
Two last sections that I'd like to talk about. If you go to page 11, I want to talk about Isaiah 24 to 27. This is a section of the book of Isaiah that some people have referred to as the little apocalypse. And the reason for that is that it leads, chapters 13 to 23 really lead into this section, because that section talks about God judging the nations of Isaiah's day. Isaiah 24 to 27 fast forwards and looks at the judgment of the whole world in the last days. And so I'm going to take 10 minutes to teach through this section. And when it gets 11:34, I'm like, if I'm still teaching on this, stand up and scream at me and tell me to stop, because there's one other thing that I want to do. But a very interesting passage, because God is going to judge the nations. All right, he judged Babylon, Assyria, all these people in the past. But God is also going to judge the nations in the future. And the question is, why? These nations did not have the Mosaic law. They did not have the special covenant. But there's another covenant that the whole world has with God that they have violated. And in the end times, God says judgment is going to fall on the whole world because of this. So let's look at Isaiah chapter 24, verses 1 to 5. And I want to explain what this covenant is. Why is God ultimately going to judge all peoples and all nations? Why is God ultimately going to judge the United States? Well, kind of the explanation is given here. And we see this kind of worldwide judgment that's going to fall on the world beginning in verse 1. Behold, the Lord will empty the earth and make it desolate, and he will twist its surface and scatter its inhabitants. And it shall be as with the people, so with the priest. As with the slave, so with the master. As with the maid, so with the mistress. It doesn't matter who you are, the judgment is going to fall on the whole world. The question is, okay, why is this going to happen? Verse 3. The earth shall be utterly empty and utterly plundered, for the Lord has spoken this word. Verse 4. The earth mourns and withers, the world languishes and withers, the highest people of the earth languish. The whole world has been wiped out by this thing. Here's the explanation in verse 5. The earth lies defiled under its inhabitants, for they have transgressed the laws, violated the statutes, and broken the everlasting covenant. Okay? And again, I don't think this is the Mosaic law, because that wasn't given to the nations. That was given to Israel. So what laws has the whole world broken? What covenant have they violated? And they have broken the eternal covenant. I think the answer to this is not, again, it's not the Abrahamic covenant, it's not the Mosaic covenant, it's not the Davidic covenant. All of those were made with Israel. But there's a covenant that God made with all of humanity in the days of Noah. And I think that's the covenant that's in view here. And so when it talks about the eternal covenant, I think it's going back to Genesis chapter 9. And God made a covenant with all of humanity. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. So God made a covenant with all of humanity to hold them accountable for how they treated each other. And all of the violence that has been done in the world, and all of the things that have happened, even in the 20th century, 40 million people died in warfare, and in various types of oppressions and all those things in the 20th century. I think what this passage is saying is that ultimately, going back to this Noahic covenant, God is ultimately going to judge the whole world. And so the basis of the judgment of these nations is, Isaiah says in chapter 26, the earth is going to disclose the blood that is shed upon her. And so God has individually judged nations like Babylon, Assyria. I believe that God judged the Soviet Empire, and God has judged nations all throughout history because of how they have violated the Noahic covenant. But in the end times, there is going to be a final judgment where God says, that's enough. And all of the world is finally going to be held accountable. And I think that judgment is what's being described in in Isaiah chapter 24 through chapter 27. This is the final judgment in the end times that's going to fall on all peoples. When it talks about the bloodshed being shed on the earth, look down chapter 24, verses 19 and 20. It says, the earth is utterly broken, the earth is split apart, the earth is violently shaken, the earth staggers like a drunken man. All right, why is God going to judge the earth? And chapter 26, it's going to talk about the Lord is going to disclose all of the bloodshed that's on the earth. And so we almost imagine it like this. There's like a blood meter, all right? And this is not the blood drive, at the local school or at the military base. God is keeping account of all of the sins and the violence and the injustice and the oppression and evil that's done in the world. And at the point in the end time where God says, that's enough, then He is going to bring His judgment based on the Noahic covenant. And you start thinking about that in terms of the United States. I mean, we abort 1 million babies, on a yearly basis? Ultimately, the blood meter reaches a point where God says, for every individual nation, enough. And if God doesn't judge America, he's going to have to apologize to Sodom and Gomorrah. And ultimately, the blood meter reaches a point where, with the whole world, where the Lord says, that's enough. I'm going to bring my judgment. And that's what Isaiah 24 to 27 is describing. Now, it does this through the image of contrasting for us two different cities. And there's this one city, it's the ruthless city, it's the city of chaos. I don't think it's talking about a specific place. I think it's talking about the image of man in rebellion against God. And it's maybe a city like Babylon, or it may even be a city like Jerusalem in the days of Isaiah. But God is going to destroy this city, and God's judgment is going to fall on the whole world. And I can't read this section without thinking about the images and pictures that we saw on 9/11 back in 2001. And this terrible catastrophe happening to a city and people running from that. Imagine what it's going to be like when God's judgment comes and that type of catastrophe is falling on the whole world. I mean, the images that came out of New York or out of D.C. that day, they were horrible to see that. But to think about a future time where God's judgment is going to fall on the whole world, that's what Isaiah is describing. And so we think about the importance of warning people about this judgment, sharing the good news, sharing the gospel. This is ultimately what people are going to be saved from when they've put their trust in Christ and this final judgment is coming on the whole world. Because there's a contrast between this violent, ruthless, wicked, corrupt city that's going to be destroyed, and then there's the city of Jerusalem, the city of God, that's going to be protected and preserved and saved. So there are two different cities that are contrasted here that I think ultimately represent the whole world. God's people are going to be delivered in this final judgment. On the other hand, the whole world is finally going to be held accountable for all of the sins and all of the things that have happened throughout history. There's a time where there's a final accountability. All right, it's 11:33. I have one more minute. Okay? And part of the reason that I wanted to share this part of the book of Isaiah, one of my favorite passages in the whole book is found here. In fact, I've kind of like told my wife I want this verse read at my funeral because it's just one of the great passages of all time. Isaiah chapter 25. And even if I have to go to 11:35, I want to explain this just for a minute. All right, after this great judgment comes, there is going to be this huge celebration and a banquet that God invites all of his people to come to. And listen to the description of this. It says, "On this mountain, the Lord of hosts will make for all peoples a feast of rich food, and a feast of well-aged wine, of rich food full of marrow, and of wine well refined." So after this terrible judgment, there's going to be a huge banquet and celebration. And I think describing God's kingdom and the joy and the celebration and the blessing that we're going to experience in that. But the greatest blessing of all in the kingdom is not just that we're going to be able to eat any of the meat that we want. The cholesterol is not going to count against us. All right, that's a pretty good deal. But it says in verse 8, it says, he will swallow up death forever. And the Lord will wipe away all the tears from their faces. And the reproach of his people he will take away from all the earth, for the Lord has spoken. And so there's this promise that one of the reasons that there's going to be this great banquet, and one of the reasons that it's going to be such a time of great celebration, is that the Lord is going to destroy death. And I remember going to a funeral of a friend of mine just last year, a very close friend, lost his life to cancer at 52. And just how much of a comfort it is to think death ultimately loses. Because there's this promise that in the eschatological banquet that we're going to celebrate and rejoice and eat all this rich food and all this stuff, And the thing that we're going to be celebrating is the Lord is going to swallow up death. Now, why? It sounds like a strange statement for us. The Lord is going to swallow up death. So what I told my wife, what I want her to do is, at my funeral, we're going to pass out big gulps. And we're going to sing, we're going to read this passage, and everybody's going to swallow down the big gulp. And that's, God is going to swallow up death. Well, what's the point of that illustration? Well, in Isaiah's day, the pagan people, the Canaanites around Israel, they believed that death was actually a god. I mean, it was a personal god. His name was Mot, which is the Hebrew word for death. And there's one of the pagan texts that talks about the power of Mot, the power of death. And it says that he has one lip extended to the heavens and another lip extended to the earth, and he swallows everything that is in between. And I think that basically was the pagan way of saying death wins all the time. This powerful being, it swallows up all of us. And remember back in chapter 5, death has this insatiable appetite where he's going to swallow up the people in judgment. This passage is saying one day the great swallower gets swallowed. And the destructive power of death that eats and consumes and destroys everything in its path, ultimately, one day, that's going to be destroyed. The Canaanites believed that their god Baal, every year, basically, was swallowed up by death, and he would have to go down into the underworld until he was resurrected and restored back. This passage says death doesn't swallow up the Lord swallows up death. So it's just a beautiful. So if you're around and would like to come to my funeral, make sure that you bring your big gulp when you come. Okay? Because this is really the reason why there's going to be such a celebration when this future kingdom comes. Okay? All right. I know we went through that section really quickly, but any questions or comments? Okay, if you think that we went through that quickly, I want to spend the last 20 minutes or so just talking about some things in the second half of the book and the promises that are there. Would you look with me at page 15? I remember that chapters 1 to 39 are primarily about judgment. Chapters 49 to 55 and 56 to 66 are primarily about God's salvation. And the Lord makes this incredible promise to them that He is going to save them out of their bondage and their exile in Babylon. And there are all kinds of verses. We won't read them. I'm giving you a long list here. Really, the return from exile is described as a second Exodus. And you remember how God brought the people out of Egypt, and He rescued them and restored them out of Egypt? Well, when God does this, bringing the people out of Babylon, it's going to be just like the Exodus in the past, except the second Exodus is going to be even bigger and better than the one in the past. The first Exodus, God rescued them out of one nation, out of Egypt. In the second Exodus, He's going to rescue them out of many nations. In the first Exodus, they had to leave Egypt in a hurry because the Egyptians were going to be chasing after them. They're not going to need to do that in the second Exodus. In the first Exodus, they had to go through the wilderness, and it was difficult and it was hard. And remember, there were a lot of times when they didn't have food and water, and they complained about that. Well, in the second Exodus, God is going to transform the wilderness into an oasis. And, it's just going to be easy for them to go home. In the first Exodus, They went to the land and they disobeyed and they turned away from God. In the second Exodus, God's going to bring them back and they're going to obey Him and love Him forever. I mean, great, incredible promise. So what I'd like us to look at on page, if we could move over to page 18, I want to talk about how does the servant of the Lord, how is this servant that is promised to Israel in the future, how is he going to be the one that brings Israel's restoration? Okay? Now, there are two people or two individuals that are very strategic to this great salvation that the Lord has promised for Israel in the future. Now, the Lord is, first of all, He's going to raise up a king by the name of Cyrus. And Cyrus is the king of Persia who defeats Babylon and issues a decree that allows the Jewish people to go back to their homeland. The amazing thing is, Isaiah announced the arrival of this king by name 150 years before it happens. Now, if I were to tell you, in 150 years, the New York Yankees are going to win the World Series, that's a pretty good prediction. But if I go beyond that and name the starting pitcher in Game 7 of that World Series 150 years ahead of time, that's really impressive. And Isaiah, 150 years in advance, says there's going to be this future king named Cyrus. He's going to bring the deliverance of my people. Okay? He's going to solve their military problem. He is going to get them back to the land and deliver them from their bondage in Babylon. But there is a second figure who is going to be the ultimate source of their salvation. God is also going to raise up a servant. And this servant, by his suffering and by his death, he's going to solve Israel's spiritual problem. And what exactly is Israel's spiritual problem? Their sin. And so, by dying for the sins of the people, this suffering servant is ultimately going to be the one that saves and restores Israel. I mean, it's great that they're going to be back in the land, but getting back in the land isn't the real issue. They don't need to just return to their homeland. They need to come back to the Lord. And the servant is going to be the one who makes this possible. Okay? Now, as we study the book of Isaiah, and as we read it, though, and you guys have asked just about every possible hard question that could be asked. You've done your job. You've done a good job with your homework. Another one of the difficult questions in the book of Isaiah is what? Who exactly is the servant? And in fact, if you were to talk to Jewish people and ask them, well, who is this suffering servant of the Lord? They would say that, well, it's not the Messiah, it's Israel. Israel's the suffering servant. And when you read Isaiah, there's some big questions. Is the servant the nation, or is it an individual? And my answer to that question is, it's actually both. And the servant of the Lord starts out as Israel, but ultimately becomes an individual who is going to save Israel. And the way that he does that is by dying for their sins. Okay? So let's talk about Israel as the servant of the Lord. There's a lot of questions. Exactly, who is this servant? And some people have argued, well, the servant, that's Israel. Or the servant is a prophet. Maybe Isaiah is talking about himself. Or maybe he's prophesying about someone like Jeremiah in the future. You remember when the Ethiopian eunuch is reading this passage over in Acts chapter 8. He says, who is this guy talking about? Is he talking about himself? And so some people have tried to make that argument. And then I think we understand that ultimately this passage is about the Messiah. It's about Jesus Christ. But in the book of Isaiah, the servant of the Lord is both Israel and the Messiah. And real quickly, in about 15 minutes, I want to try to explain how those two things are related to each other. There are a number of passages, and I've listed these for you at the bottom of page 18. Israel is referred to as the servant of the Lord. Okay? And to show you why they're referred to in that way, I'd like for you to turn to Isaiah chapter 42. Okay, Israel is referred to as the servant of the Lord because as a nation and as a people, they had a special mission from God. And we've already talked about that just a few minutes ago. Israel's job was to be God's missionary people and to show to all of the nations what the true God was like and to bring other nations to an understanding and a belief in this true God. The problem is, how well did Israel do with its mission? Okay, they failed miserably. Instead of leading the other nations to the Lord, they ended up wanting to worship all of the gods of the other nations. And so in Isaiah 42, verses 18 to 22, Isaiah is basically going to say, God called Israel to be his servant, and they failed miserably. Okay, so let's read what he has to say here. He says, "Hear you deaf, and look you blind, that you may see. Who is blind but my servant? Or deaf as my messengers whom I send? Who is as blind as my dedicated one, or as blind as the servant of the Lord? He sees many things, but does not observe them. His ears are open, but he does not hear. And the Lord was pleased for his righteousness' sake to make his law and to make it glorious. But this is a people plundered and looted. They are all of them trapped in holes and hidden in prison." So here's what Isaiah is saying. I called Israel to be my servant. I called Israel. Their job was to show my glory to the other nations. And if they had obeyed my law, that I made great and glorious, if they had obeyed my law, they would have drawn these other people to God like a magnet. The other people would have been coming to them, begging them, saying, "Teach us about this God that has blessed you. We want to know him." But what does this passage say? They were blind and they were deaf. And so instead of reflecting God's glory to the nations and bringing the other nations to the Lord, they were a failure. And Isaiah says, God's intent was, through Abraham, all the nations of the earth are going to be blessed. In Exodus 19, Israel is going to be a kingdom of priests who lead other people to God. That was their job. But Israel, as a nation, was a blind and a deaf servant. They were supposed to lead others to God, and they're blind and need someone to lead them around. And so the point of Israel being the servant of God in Isaiah is that as a nation, they failed. And so what is going to happen with the servant of the Lord is that God is going to raise up an individual servant who is related to Israel. And as he suffers and as he dies and as he is obedient to God and fulfills his mission, he is going to bring the national servant back to himself. And we begin to see this individual servant very clearly, I think, in a passage in Isaiah chapter 49, verse 3, and Isaiah chapter 49, verse 6. Okay, if you'll turn there just real quickly. Okay, this is one of the servant psalms, and the servant speaks in chapter 49, verse 3, and he said to me, "You are my servant, Israel, in whom I will be glorified." Okay, who is God's servant here? Okay, Israel. All right, it's almost 12 o'clock and you're still with me enough to realize that. Israel is identified here. They're God's servant. But notice the description that we have of the servant in verse 6. The servant is not just Israel. The servant also has a ministry to Israel. And so in verse 6, it's going to say, it is too light a thing that you should be my servant to raise up the tribes of Jacob. And so now we're not just talking about the nation as God's servant. We're talking about an individual who has a ministry to Israel. And he is the individual servant. And his mission is to restore these people, to bring them back to God. And when you look at the individual servant, he's very different from the national servant. Okay? How is this servant different from the nation? Well, there's like 3 or 4 things. The individual servant suffers for the sins of other people. Israel is going to suffer for its own sins. The national servant is described as blind and deaf. They have not obeyed God. The individual servant in chapter 50 obeys the mission that God gives to him. He is completely faithful to God's calling. The national servant questions, well, why has God sent us into exile? The individual servant is able to fully trust in the Lord. And so what I think you have clearly revealed in the book of Isaiah is that there is a difference between this individual servant who is faithful, who is obedient, who fulfills the mission that God has given to him, and this national servant that did not obey. And the way that the individual servant fulfills his mission is that he comes and as a prophet and as a priest and as a king, he fulfills the role that God has given to him. And his mission in life is to restore the national servant so that they can again become the people of God. And so I think there's a distinction here between the 2 different servants, the one that is faithful to God and the one that is not. Okay? Any questions or comments? I know we went through that very quickly, but any questions or comments just about that? Okay, could I just read a couple of points here on page 19? How does the servant fulfill his mission? I think he's going to come as a prophet, as a priest, and as a king. In chapter 42, he's like a king because he establishes and brings forth justice. Like a prophet, he proclaims the word of the Lord to Israel and to the nations. Like a prophet also, and I think of Jeremiah here, he suffers persecution for being faithful and proclaiming God's word. Isaiah 50 talks about his back being beaten and taking persecution because he faithfully proclaims the word of the Lord. And then finally, to see the suffering servant in Isaiah 53, he fulfills his mission because as a priest, he offers a sacrifice for the sins of others. And his own life and his own body becomes the sacrifice that ultimately restores the people of Israel to God. And so if we could, maybe we'll just wrap up today by looking at this passage in Isaiah 53 that talks about the suffering servant. Why did the servant have to suffer? Well, in verse 3, we get what Israel thinks about the suffering servant. And here's their explanation. They say, he was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, as one from whom men hide their faces. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. Okay, we looked at his suffering, and we didn't see anything that caused us to want to honor him or recognize him as an exalted person. And then they even go on to say, we come to realize in verse 4, surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. All right. We have come to realize that ultimately he was dying for us. But when Israel saw the suffering servant at the beginning, their view of him is exactly what Job's friends said about Job. The reason Job is suffering, why? He sinned. The reason this servant is suffering, he must have done some awful sin because God is punishing him horribly. But they say, we came to realize that he was not being afflicted for his own sins. He was dying for ours. And in verse 6, we get the, verse 5 and verse 6, we get the true explanation of why the servant suffered. He was wounded for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his stripes we were healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned everyone to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. We were the ones that committed the sin. We were the ones that disobeyed. But the Lord has caused the punishment that we deserved to fall on him. And the message in Isaiah is that through that, that's how the national servant is ultimately brought back to God and restored to its mission. And as we move into the New Testament and begin to see this, we get in on the benefits of the servant's sacrifice as well, because he wasn't just dying for disobedient Israel. He was dying for our sins as well. So, to kind of map this out in the book of Isaiah, the way that it looks is that the explanation here is that the individual servant will restore the national servant by suffering and dying for their sins so that they can become God's people once again. The most interesting thing about the word servant in the book of Isaiah, after Isaiah 53, is that the word appears 11 different times in chapters 54 to 66. And every time it appears in the plural. Because now we're back to looking at the national servant, not just the individual. So the way this thing begins, and I thought I had a slide that illustrated this, but I'm going to have to do it with my hands. You know, we start out very broadly. The servant is the nation. It becomes focused on one individual in passages like chapter 50 and 53. And then at the end, it broadens out again because the suffering of that one individual becomes the way that all of Israel is going to be restored. He provides the sacrifice that saves them and delivers them from their sins. Now, obviously, we know who is the servant. The New Testament makes that very clear. This is the mission of Jesus. To die and to give his life as a sacrifice for others. And Mark chapter 10, verse 45. The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and give his life a ransom for many. Jesus is defining his mission in light of Isaiah 53. Acts chapter 8, the Ethiopian eunuch reading Isaiah 53. Who is the prophet talking about? Himself or someone else? Philip says, let me tell you, I know who he's talking about. He's talking about Jesus. And so the mission of Jesus was to become this servant in Isaiah, to provide the salvation and the restoration that's promised in the second half of the book. Okay? That's a very quick lesson and discussion on the servant of the Lord, but I think kind of gives us some insight into the way that this idea is developed in the book of Isaiah. Any questions or comments?
In Isaiah 53, where it talks about by his wounds we are healed. That healed, you know what the interpretation is, or the Greek word for heal is I know we always refer to it as just a physical healing, but is there
Yeah, and actually, you know, it is the word that would be normally used for just physical healing or whatever. But I think physical healing here is more a picture of the spiritual healing that Israel needed. And it's the healing from their sin that ultimately this passage is talking about. If you want to connect it to a specific passage in Isaiah, you might even want to go back to chapter 1, where he talks about Israel. They're bloody, they're wounded, their wounds are open and festering and bleeding. They need healing. And the way that that's going to be provided is through the sacrifice of the servant. So I think it's more of kind of a picture of their spiritual restoration using the image of physical healing for them. Yes.
But some people, the Isaiah 53 chapter, and the Cyrus is the prince of Persia 100 years in advance. Common response as well, that was inserted later to make it appear to be a prophecy, because there's no way they could have been that accurate in that. So we just assume that it was kind of inserted into the text later on. So how do you respond to those critics?
Yeah, and that's really outside of evangelical circles. That's the common idea. Isaiah didn't write this because he couldn't have written the last 27 chapters of the book. It has too many explicit details about the exile. But one of the arguments that Isaiah is going to make in this section is the reason that you can trust God's promises here is because God has the ability to announce the future ahead of time. And this section of the book is very unique because we don't have a prophecy that often gives us this many explicit details about something that's going to happen 150 years in advance. But I think there's a theological reason for this. It's going to be very hard for these people to believe that God is going to save them and deliver them out of Babylon. And I think God revealing all of these details in advance, even down to the point where he names the general that's going to be the deliverer, I think it's God's way of assuring them, I know what's going to happen. I'm in control of this. And as you can see it taking place, you can know that I'm the one that's bringing this about. But yeah, that's kind of the common view that outside of evangelical circles, there's no way that Isaiah could have been this specific about all the things that he prophesies here. All right, 12:03. Can I read one more verse and then I promise we're done? All right, aren't you glad that the servant provided that kind of sacrifice for us?
Amen.
I mean, the suffering, death, and agony, Jesus did that for us. All right, it's one thing to embrace what Jesus did for us, but I want you to look at something that Paul does with the servant songs in Acts chapter 13. And this will be our closing verse for today. Paul quotes Isaiah 49:6 in this passage, not just to talk about Jesus and the mission of Jesus, but also to talk about himself and his mission. And Paul explains in this passage, why are you a missionary to the Gentiles? Well, because the role of the servant was to be a light to the nations. And so here's what it says, Acts 13, verse 46. Paul and Barnabas spoke out boldly, saying, it was necessary that the word of God be spoken first to you, to the Jews. But since you thrust it aside and judge yourselves unworthy of eternal life, behold, we are turning to the Gentiles. For so the Lord has commanded us, saying, and here it is, Isaiah 49, verse 6, I have made you a light for the Gentiles, that you may bring my salvation to the ends of the earth. Paul does not see Jesus alone as being the servant. He says the mission of the servant is also the mission of the church. And so it's one thing to believe, well, you know what, Jesus suffered for me so that I could experience this salvation and this forgiveness and restoration. It's another thing to say, I want to take on that mission myself. And as a follower of Jesus, I become a servant of the servant so that other people can see that light extended to them. And that's what Paul is saying. It's not just the servant's job to be the light to the nations. We're followers of the servant. And so we're going to become a light to the nation. We're going to take the gospel to the Gentiles. And for Paul, that meant if I have to suffer like Jesus did, then I'm willing to do it. If I have to go through oppression and persecution the way that the servant did, then I'm willing to do it. But our mission is not just to believe in what the servant has done for us. Our calling is to become servants of the Lord ourselves, and to take on this willingness to suffer and to proclaim and to tell others about what Jesus has done, so that that light can be extended to the Gentiles. Paul says that's what my life is about. That's what my mission is about. And I think that's what our lives are about as Christians as well. So there's an application beyond saying, praise the Lord, the servant did this for us. It's now, it puts an obligation upon us. Are we willing to become servants of the servant? And I think that's a good question to ask as we kind of wrap these things up this morning. Pastor, would you mind praying, please?